This video is about break-even analysis. In operations and supply chain management, we use break-even for two types of problems. First, when we want to conduct some financial analysis whereby if cost and revenues they are equal, we call it a break-even point. And second, when we want to make a decision between two alternatives or two options, for example, in this case, make or buy decisions, we want to analyze this using break-even analysis. Break-even point would be the one whereby two options, make or buy, they are equally good. Here is an example of break-even analysis for make or buy decisions. Here's a problem. A business is evaluating two alternatives for sourcing a critical component producing in-house or procuring from a supplier. The fixed cost for in-house production is $2,500, while for procuring from a supplier it is $500. In-house production incurs a variable cost of $5 per unit, while procurement from the supplier entails a variable cost of $7 per unit. What is the most cost-effective option for the company taking into account the annual demand ranging from 10,000 to 15,000 units? Now in this problem, we have two alternatives. One is company can make in-house and the other option is that they can buy from a supplier. But this decision must be rooted in cost analysis. So we have been given two types of cost. One is fixed cost, and the fixed cost for making in-house is $25,000, which is a big amount. And that makes sense because when you want to produce something in-house, you will need machinery, equipment, property to set up factory, and all these type of things which will incur a huge fixed cost. However, if you decide to buy from supplier, then that fixed cost would be very small. It could include contractual agreements, and then there is variable cost. Variable cost, that's the cost per unit, and this cost is always per unit. So the variable cost when the company makes it in-house is $5, but when they buy it from a supplier, then that incurs $7. Annual demand is expected to be 15,000. We will be exploring it for a range from 10,000 to 15,000 units. Now this decision whether company should produce it in-house or should they buy from the supplier, that's based on cost. How much cost each alternative incurs. So for cost, we'll be using this formula, which is total cost is equal to fixed cost plus variable cost multiplied by quantity. And variable cost is always given per unit. So this is $5 per unit. Similarly, this is $7 per unit. Therefore, total cost becomes fixed cost, that's $25,000 plus variable cost and multiplied by quantity. Whatever is the quantity, we'll be using that. So in this case, we will set up two equations, one for make alternative and other for buy alternative. And the equation for make alternative becomes this one, that's fixed cost. Fixed cost for make option is 25,000, so this is 25,000 plus variable cost per unit, that's 5, and multiplied by quantity. Total cost for buy option will be 500, which is the fixed cost for buy alternative, plus 7, that's per unit cost multiplied by quantity. Now we want to conduct break-even analysis whereby these two options are equally good. The total cost is equal, and for that purpose we set these two equations equal. So as you can see here that these two equations, they have been set equal. When we solve it, it will give us 12,250 units. So that's called as break-even point. When the demand is 12,250 units, then it doesn't make any difference. You go for buy option or you go for make option. Both will incur equal cost. However, if annual demand is different, then for example, if it is less, then one of these two options will be better. And similarly, if annual demand exceeds this cost, then again one of these two options will be good. Now we will be using Microsoft Excel to determine this break-even point. This is the same data whereby we have these two alternatives, make and buy, and this is their fixed cost, and fixed cost for make option is $25,000 and fixed cost for buy is $500, and variable cost in case of make alternative is $5 and variable cost for buy is $7. Now in the next step we will calculate total cost, and the formula for total cost is fixed cost and I will lock it because in the next step I want to copy the same formula to other cells. So I will lock it by pressing F4 key plus unit cost. Again I will lock it and multiply it by quantity. So in this case I am assuming quantity is 0. So that becomes our total cost when quantity is 0. And similarly for buy option, the formula will become fixed cost. I will lock it by pressing Fn F4 plus variable cost per unit, that's 7. Again I will lock it, multiplied by quantity, which is 0 in this case, and it gives us this one, $500. So which means if we assume quantity is 0, then make option would incur a cost of $25,000, which is the fixed cost, which means the company has to pay this cost. There is no variable cost because quantity is 0. If I copy this formula to other cells, it gives us this one. Now here are some values of quantities. You can also add here 100, 500, 200 and 300. I'll be explaining this further. Now in the next step we are gonna make a graph, and for graph I'll be using these three values: quantity, make, alternative and buy alternative. Click on insert, and here we have this one. Now that gives us a graph. We need to refine it. First of all, in this graph there is this blue line, and when you see, when I click on the blue line, this is highlighted, which means that this blue line, it represents quantity. We don't need this, so I will delete this one. Just click on this blue line and hit delete key, and that's gone. Now in the next step I want to refine this graph a little bit. So I will click on this x-axis and then right click on that and then click on select data. And once you have selected data, then the first thing is that it says what's the data range. So I want to use this data range, that is these three columns, and make sure that only that part where we are doing calculation is that selected, which means this yellow area in this case. And this is series 1. I want to call it make because that's our first alternative. And then it says y value. So y value is this one, and then the next one is horizontal. Horizontal is quantity. I want to use this one. So my idea is that I want this quantity to appear on x-axis and total cost to appear on y-axis. And then I will go for the next one, and this one I will call it buy. That's our second alternative. And for this one, y value is this one, so I will choose this one, and x-axis value is this one. That's right. And then there is a third one, we don't need it, so I will delete this one by clicking on this one. Okay, so we have got this one. So we have two options here, one is make and buy. And as you can see, the first thing is selecting data, and I selected these three columns, only this part that provides calculation, and I gave them name. In one case it's make, in other case it's buy, and then y value is total cost and x-axis value is quantity. And then when I click on OK, it makes this graph. Now let's refine it a little bit more. For example, if I click on this one, that I want this type of graph, and if I want to change colors of these lines, I will click on this one. The next thing is we will also change the title, which means make or buy decisions. Now the next thing is interpretation of this graph. Now in this graph, there are two lines. The yellow line, it represents buy option, and blue line represents make option. One of the critical piece of information in this graph is this intersection. We call this break-even point. So this break-even point is the same point that we had calculated earlier. So for instance, over here you can see when we calculated it earlier, it was 12,250. So this intersection point is 12,250. Any value that is less than break-even point, for that option, buy option will be good. Buy option is the yellow line. So for example, as you can see here, that if you take any value, for example, if you take 5,000, which means if you are producing 5,000 quantity. Now for 5,000 quantity, this represents cost, total cost, and this is quantity. So for 5,000 quantity, you can see yellow line or buy option, it presents less cost. In other words, for 5,000 quantity, the cost associated with blue line or make line is greater than the cost associated with buy option. So which means buy option is more suitable. You can also say that blue line is above yellow line. which means for any value below this break-even point, buy option will be good because the cost associated with buy option is less than cost associated with make option. So therefore, for any value below break-even point, we will choose buy. So if you if you want to buy 5,000, buy option is good. If you want to produce 10,000, again buy option is good. If you want to have 12,000, again buy option is good, until you reach this intersection point. That's called as break-even point. Now after break-even point, things change. This yellow line, which represents buy option, which was initially under this blue line, now it rises. Now things flip after this intersection point, and over here you can see, for example, for 20,000 units, if the demand is 20,000 unit, the associated cost is lower in case of make option and higher in case of buy option. Similarly, for 30,000, again, this is the cost axis. So with 30,000, this option, that's make option, it represents lower cost compared to the cost associated with buy option. So this graph tells us that below this break-even point, buy option is good, because as you can see, it's under the blue line, it represents lower cost. However, above that break-even point, make option is better. Now we can also add here some other values, and it does not change the interpretation of the graph. So for example, I want to show you, if I add here some other values, for example, if I add here 500 and 1000, then what would happen? So I insert here, so our quantity here becomes 1000 and here it becomes 2000. I drag them, our graph becomes like this one. The interpretation, the meaning of the graph, that does not change, although the shape of lines change. So for example, again it shows that any value that's less than break-even point, the yellow line still remains below the blue line, which means for any value below break-even point, buy option remains good, and for any quantity that's above break-even point, make option remains good because that represents lower cost. Now traditionally we want to have straight lines. As you can see, adding these two quantities, that's 1000 and 2000, it does not change the interpretation or the message of the graph. So I will delete them because it's not adding any new information to the graph. In the next step, we will explore what is exactly this point, although we know that this point, this intersection point, that is 12,250 units because we calculated it manually. However, we also want to know using Excel what is the exact quantity of this one. And for that one, I will use a function that's called as goal seek function. And for that we need these things. So first of all, we have this random quantity and then make and then buy and difference. The formula for total cost of make option is equal to fixed cost plus variable cost multiplied by quantity. So this one will become fixed cost, that's 25,000, plus variable cost per unit, that's Q, multiplied by quantity. Now in this case, I'll be using this quantity, this empty cell, and then in the next one for buy, again I'll be using the same formula for total cost. The total cost for buy option will be this fixed cost plus variable cost multiplied by quantity, and for quantity again I'll be using this random quantity. That's it. Now I want to calculate break-even point, and for break-even point, these two options, they become equal. So which means when they are equal, what would be their difference? Their difference would be 0. So the formula for difference will be this one minus total cost associated with buy option. Over here I will enter a random quantity. For example, I can just enter maybe 1. You can enter 2, 3, 4, 5, 100, 10,000. Doesn't make any difference. It should be a random quantity. And in the next one, I will use a goal seek function. Click on data, and in what if analysis, there's a goal seek function. Now in goal seek function, it says set cell which means we select this cell that represents the difference to value. The value should be 0 because we know that at break even the difference between these two is 0. Make, the total cost associated with make and total cost associated with buy option, it is the same, so the difference between them is 0. So we set this cell to 0 and we say by changing this cell, by changing this random quantity. Now in the next step I will just click on OK, but before I click on OK, just look here carefully. What's the value of random quantity? It's 1, which is essentially a random quantity. When I will click on OK, this one will change and the total cost will change and the difference should become 0. So I click on OK. Now as you can see here, when I click on OK, it shows that the quantity is 12,250, which is our break-even point, which means at this break-even point, the total cost in make alternative would be 86,250. And with this quantity, total cost in buy option would be 86,250, which is exactly the same. And the difference between them 0 because they are the same thing. So this is the way how we calculate break-even point. Now this break-even point, that is 12,250, it's exactly the same quantity that we had calculated manually using this equation.